All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be speaking to you today on a very trending topic and very important topic for any manufacturer in the New England region or really nationally, and that's the subject of PFAS, and more specifically, the subject of some of the PFAS litigation that is either been proposed or passed in Massachusetts and Rhode Island in the last 12 months, and really is much of it has been proposed just in the last 2 months. So this is a very hot topic and one that's very timely. And so we're very glad that you could join us today. For those of you who may not know us, we are CMBG3. We are headquartered in Boston, but we have 5 offices nationally. We represent clients coast to coast. We even have a new Detroit office in the Midwest. And one of our focuses for really the past 6 years has been PFAS. And I'm very honored to be joined today by my colleague, Daria Afshar from our firm in Boston. She is an attorney, and she is also our in-house legislative analyst for our government relations team. So we're going to be talking to you a little bit today about some of the basics. What are PFAS? I understand that some of the people on this webinar may already know that, but I also understand that some of you may not. There are many manufacturing companies, there are many industrial companies who are simply really unaware of whether or not they even are using PFAS and are unaware as to how these new laws or regulations that we're going to be talking about today can or are or will impact the companies. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about, what are PFAS and why is there so much concern about them. Then we're going to transition and Daria is really going to take over the show, and she's going to talk about the regulatory trends that we've seen in the region lately, and then the new legislation out of Massachusetts and Rhode Island that's really going to impact manufacturers. And then to conclude the day, we're going to talk about specific action steps that we can help you with and that you can take to minimize your risk right now, even before all of these proposed legislations come into effect. So with that, I think we'll just start off, and I'll kick it off with the sort of PFAS introduction. What are PFAS? Well, it stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, but nobody says that. Everybody says PFAS. You see it in the media, you hear it on TV, and you see it all over the proposed legislation and the litigation. It's a class of chemicals. This is essentially what it is. And today the EPA recognizes that there are over 12,000 different types of PFAS. So remember what I just said a second ago, many companies have no idea that they're using PFAS. One of the biggest reasons for that is because there's no box or canister or drum of chemicals or materials coming to your site that say PFAS. PFAS is a class of chemicals. So you really have to have a detailed and well-educated understanding of what specifically is a PFAS, what constitutes one of the 12,000 types of PFAS that could be at issue for your company. It could be subject to one of the proposed pieces of legislation that Daria is going to talk about. But PFAS, given their number, it's probably fairly obvious, but they've been around for a very long time. They were invented, these are man-made chemicals, they were invented in the 1930s. And it wasn't until the 1940s when they first really started being used. They were first used by the military in World War II, but it was shortly after that that the industries that created them, which were 3M and DuPont, obviously chemical giants, started using them in commercial applications that we see today. And I'll skip ahead just a slide to show you very simply. DuPont created one of the first types of PFAS, and it was marketed and branded in something that we know very well today, Teflon. Obviously, that's the non-stick coating that goes on everybody's pots and pans, but that's really where this started. DuPont was the one that created or invented or found the first type of PFAS, which is abbreviated as PFOA. That is one of the most common types of PFAS that you'll see reported on. And it's what is called one of the legacy PFAS because it was used and created and invented so long ago. In a similar vein, just a couple of years later, the other company, the 3M, created and invented another type of PFAS, which is PFOS. They marketed and branded this type of PFAS, as you see on the picture on the right, as Scotchgard, a product that's even used today, but it's been marketed and around similar to Teflon since the 1940s. So it's this PFOA and these PFOS, two types of PFAS, that have been around the longest. You see them reported on the most. They appear in the media and the legislation very, very often. But what Daria will talk about today, and what we really want to mention to everybody who's attending this webinar today, is that all of the legislation now is going well beyond just PFOA and PFOS. It may have started there, but it's much, much broader now. And it's, in some instances with specific proposed legislation, you'll see it encompasses all 12,000 plus types of PFAS. So they're really broad sweeping. So why are they so valuable to industry or manufacturing? Well, it's really their characteristics. You can see here on the slide some of their most prominent characteristics: water repellency, oil repellency, heat resistance. These are all attributes that are incredibly valuable, not only for consumer products, but just for industrial processes or manufacturing processes themselves. And that's where all of these types of PFAS are primarily used. Now, some of the problems that come with that is that they bioaccumulate and they are persistent. And we'll talk about this in a second, but essentially what that means is that they have the potential, and they do accumulate in your body or in the environment very, very easily, and they're incredibly difficult to get rid of. So today, these are just, how many are there? 12. There are 12 examples of some of the categories of products that are made that use and historically have used PFAS for a very, very long time. But there are hundreds, if not thousands of them that do use PFAS and have used PFAS for decades. These are just some of the major industries that you see here. And these are some of the industries that we identified in New England in particular, where these products are either made or heavily supplied, that are really going to be impacted by some of the regulations that Daria is going to talk about today. So I mentioned just a second ago, two main concerns with PFAS in general, right? One is the persistence in the environment. And this is a very sort of detailed picture, but I think it's a very informative one, because it really helps understand, from the industrial use on the far upper left in this diagram that you see here, how widely spread PFAS can be spread throughout the environment, and how. One is through the air. PFAS can be emitted through smokestacks. They get into the rain, which then gets into the drinking water, which gets into groundwater, which gets into the ground itself, which allegedly and potentially contaminates the very food that we eat. In the same respect, all manufacturing, all industrial sites have some sort of waste stream of some sort, whether it's physical waste where it's going to a landfill, whether it's a wastewater issue where it's going to a wastewater treatment plant, or whether it's just effluent that's discharged into rivers and ultimately may find their way into drinking water. These are all avenues where PFAS can get into specific environmental areas, whether it's ground or water, and then the issue is they leach. Remember, I said that they're very biopersistent. That means they don't go away and they spread very easily. So whatever is dumped into rivers as effluent easily finds its way into the groundwater, easily finds its way into drinking water sources, and then finds its way into farmland. Similarly, landfills have a notorious reputation for leaching. Leaching just means whatever goes in slowly trickles out in some form, and PFAS is no exception. Landfills are one of the major targets of PFAS enforcement action and proposed regulations right now in this country. And the reason for that is because there's great concern that they are contributing to some degree to the PFAS contamination that's going on with respect to drinking water and groundwater. So there's a very quick sort of synopsis of the environmental concerns, but I hope it shows that really no matter what type of environmental avenue you're talking about, whether it's the air, the ground, or the water, that PFAS has a relatively easy way of getting into each one of those types of areas, and that there's obviously, given the environmental push in the country right now, there are significant concerns about PFAS accumulating in every single one of those avenues. Now, the second concern with respect to PFAS generally is the bioaccumulation that happens in the human body. So once it gets in our body, and since it doesn't leave very easily at all, what can happen? Well, this pictorial you'll find very easily on the internet. It's a very good one because it shows for one of the major studies with respect to one type of PFAS, exactly what types of human health concerns there are. The effects that are in the bold lines here are the ones that a science panel has found a high certainty of a connection between that type of PFAS and this health effect. And they are thyroid disease, cholesterol issues, liver damage, kidney cancer, testicular cancer, and in vitro fertilization issues. Now, I keep mentioning that this study was done not with respect to all PFAS. It was done with respect to one. That was the original one that was made by DuPont, PFOA. The issue that we see, and Daria will touch on this again, is that in a lot of the legislation that is being proposed and passed, and even the litigation that we're involved in for our clients, this study with respect to this one type of PFAS, PFOA, has been sort of extrapolated to apply to all 12,000 types of PFAS. So you'll often see in the media, in litigation, even in proposed regulations, it's not just PFOA causes these things or has been found to potentially cause these things in humans, but all PFAS do. We obviously feel that that's not scientifically supported at the moment, and there is a large movement for supporting that opinion as well. So with that sort of backdrop in mind, before we get into Massachusetts and Rhode Island, I think it's very important to just understand what's going on at the federal level, because a lot of what's going on at the federal level is also driving what's going on at the state level. So really, we have two big initiatives that we'll just spend just 2 minutes on that the federal EPA is pushing forth with respect to PFAS. One is drinking water. There's been a large amount of concern for many years now that the avenue and the way that we are all consuming PFAS and getting it into our bodies through our drinking water. And remember that slide I just showed you about all the environmental ways that PFAS get into and stay in the environment. Drinking water is really the one, aside from food, where we consume it every day, if not every hour, every 30 minutes, whatever it may be, but we're all drinking it all the time. So the EPA has really targeted drinking water to try and set what it calls enforceable limits for how much PFAS can be in drinking water. Well, what does this mean? It means if the EPA or any of the state arms of the EPA goes and tests drinking water sources, and the amount of PFAS, regulated PFAS that are in that drinking water source are above whatever the enforceable limit is set by the federal EPA, the EPA can go after companies that it feels has contaminated or polluted those drinking water sources in some way, and force them to pay for the remediation or the cleanup costs. That may not sound like an enormous deal, but it truthfully is. We've seen this play out all across the country so far because there are states with their own enforceable drinking water limits, and it can cost anywhere from hundreds of thousands of dollars to upwards of tens of millions of dollars, depending on the scope of the pollution. So the big news happened last week, of course. The EPA for the first time put out a proposal for what it says should be the drinking water limit for certain types of PFAS in drinking water, and that is 4 parts per trillion. We're not going to get into the science and what does 4 parts per trillion really mean, but suffice it to say, it's incredibly, incredibly low. And if you were to test drinking water, there's a high probability that you're probably going to find the types of PFAS that are being regulated at a level set that low. So this is significant. It's a proposed regulation at this point, but it's very clear from the Biden administration and the EPA that this regulation is intended to be finished and finalized by the end of this year. Second, there is such a thing as the Superfund law. Many of us have probably heard of at least Superfund sites. So in order for the EPA to have the power and the authority to designate a site as a Superfund site, and more importantly for them, to force the polluting parties to pay for the cleanup of that Superfund site, they have to designate the chemicals at issue under the Superfund law as, quote, hazardous substances. Right now, under the Superfund law, there are no PFAS listed as hazardous substances. But there was a proposal put forth last fall by the EPA to designate those two legacy or the initial PFAS that I mentioned, PFOA, PFOS, as hazardous substances. Again, what this means is that they would then, once this rule is finalized, have the power to go to companies, manufacturers, industries that may in some way be polluting land in their area, or even if they send waste to other sites, the EPA can pursue cleanup costs for any site that it wishes to where it finds those, quote, hazardous substances. So that law is coming as well and will have an enormous impact. Both of these, proposed, soon to be finalized laws are having incredible downstream impacts on the states, and in many ways is fueling the state level initiatives to put forth even more aggressive PFAS regulations, which is what Daria is going to talk about for us next. But I just wanted to highlight before I kick it to Daria, this last slide. Really what started all of this federal regulatory action was this 2001 report by the EPA, what it called its EPA roadmap. And it set forth a lot of things in here that it wanted to do. So far, it's done almost all of them to the time commitments that it said it would. But I want to highlight for the webinar today, the last one, which I've highlighted and put in red. There is an explicit goal set forth in this plan by the EPA, in which it says that once we do all of these things and once we have the federal regulatory authority to pursue polluters and make them pay, that is exactly what we want to do. And it has been quite clear since this report came out that they are not just talking about going after 3M or DuPont or other companies that may have made these PFAS chemicals. They are going to be looking, and states are already doing this, that have these drinking water laws in place. They're going to be looking at manufacturing companies, industrial companies that used PFAS and then in some way put them into the environment. It does not matter under these laws whether or not the companies did so knowingly or intentionally or willfully. It just simply matters that there was a discharge of PFAS and it resulted in a testing level that was above the set regulatory limit. So this is going to have enormous impacts on everyone on this call today. If there is a PFAS concern or historical use or legacy issue within your company, which we can help you navigate for sure. So that's the federal picture. And at this point, I'm going to mute myself and we're going to kick it over to Daria, who's going to talk to you more specifically about Massachusetts and Rhode Island's initiatives with respect to PFAS. Daria?
Awesome. Hello, everyone. And thank you so much, John, for the introduction. And thank you also to John for always being such a valuable guide as we navigate PFAS. As someone with a background in policy, I can attest that we rely on thought leaders like John to demystify complex landscapes like PFAS so that they can be addressed with full understanding at the government level, and also in the context of business operation and in litigation as well. So I'm going to start by sharing with you the legislative trends that we are seeing with respect to PFAS. If we can go to the next slide. So this graphic shows the pretty observable increase in interest that policymakers have in PFAS right now. The red bar, as you can see, represents the number of bills filed in Congress. The green represents the same in the Massachusetts state legislature, and the blue the same in the Rhode Island state legislature. So each of these government bodies operate obviously on different schedules and in different capacities, but it is clear that PFAS is becoming a serious focal point for lawmakers at every level. In Congress, we've seen a sharp spike in proposed PFAS regulations, largely in response to the outpouring of new studies, research, public awareness that's surfacing on the issue. That trend we're seeing for PFAS regulation is pretty typical to other regulatory trends. When the public, obviously, and the scientific community start to direct more attention and resources to a public health issue, like we saw with COVID, you will have a stronger public demand for action at the government level, and that is showing itself, as you can see in this graph. We're seeing it right now with PFAS, and we saw it when the EPA released their drinking water restrictions. it's manifesting in the creation of state-sanctioned task forces to investigate PFAS. And you can see it every day in the news. It's a hot button issue that's only going to increase in popularity, which attracts policymakers to regulate it. So as you can see, we have an uptick from 40 to 105 bills filed in Congress from January of 22 to January of 23. You can see in February, there was a good chunk of straggler bills filed, usually by legislators who want to have a seat at the PFAS table per se. A lot of these bills call for full-blown regulatory reform, but a lot of them also are simply mitigation efforts, which include funding initiatives, spot fixes for the sponsors' districts. In Massachusetts, however, we are seeing very intentional and measured efforts to PFAS regulation. While the number of the bills may seem low, they do pack a punch, and we're going to get into that. The same goes for Rhode Island, which has already passed significant PFAS reform into law. Between 2018 and 2022, before this, we've seen hundreds of PFAS bills filed, but it's looking like all of this effort is culminating into a more viable policy platform in 2023. And it's expected that a lot of these reforms will cross the finish line in the near future. So if we can go to the next slide to start with Rhode Island. So this legislature has been a trailblazer in New England when it comes to PFAS regulation. While Massachusetts is the economic hub of New England, it usually waits until other states have enacted reforms to see how they pan out before doing it themselves. And now we have that for PFAS. Rhode Island passed legislation last year, and Massachusetts is currently taking notes and taking some action. So in June 2022, Rhode Island passed laws to regulate 6 types of PFAS, and that's in food packaging, but also in drinking water, groundwater, surface waters, and landfills. But as far as food packaging goes, it does put strict regulations on companies doing business in Rhode Island, and these regulations are enforceable. It also means that companies that have not assessed their PFAS use must do so immediately or face potential consequences. And these consequences could take the form of costly remediation efforts, lawsuits, or the need to quickly change business operations to minimize risk and get in compliance. So this bill in Rhode Island, it's Rhode Island's ban on PFAS packaging, and it goes into effect this coming January. It prohibits the sale of promotional distribution of any food packaging that contains intentionally added PFAS in the state of Rhode Island. And efforts to pass this policy are going on all over the country, including in Massachusetts. And so this, they already got done, and it's going to be probably some form of domino effect here. So if we go to the next slide, and this bill is currently pending in Rhode Island. It has not passed, but it seeks to ban the sale of certain products with PFAS content by 2025. And these include the usual suspects for PFAS, which include carpets, furniture, textiles, clothing, cosmetics, children's products, and cookware, as John touched on earlier. This bill also seeks an all-out ban on the sale of any product at all containing PFAS by 2032. So this is major as far as implications for businesses selling products in Rhode Island. The bill would also require manufacturers to report on the state of, actually, if we go over to the next slide, I think that touches on it. So reporting requirements for manufacturers on the composition of their PFAS containing products for the purposes of future regulation. So the state kind of wants to get a sense of what's in all these products, where are they being sold, how often are they being purchased, so that, you'll see more regulations down the line after they account for everything. And this would kick in 2026 if this bill were to pass this session. So moving up to Massachusetts, we go to the next slide. We are tracking 2 major bills this session that very apparently have the most momentum. The first is the Toxic Free Kids Act, which would specifically ban children's products containing PFAS. And this bill includes an extremely broad definition of children's products, and this ranges from teething toys to artificial turf fields, which you wouldn't typically expect to be a children's product. So it also includes toys, clothing, cosmetics, school supplies, bedding, furniture, and car seats, anything that's marketed for and advertised to children for the use by children. If the state determines a high priority chemical is in one of these products, manufacturers will be required to report to the state and may face penalties. This would start to go into effect a year after the bill passes into law. A year after the bill passes, the Department of Environmental Protection would have to start promulgating regulations. And so then things would really start ramping up. Our primary focus, however, is in Massachusetts, is on the PFAS omnibus. And this was filed by State Senator Julian Cyr and State Representative Kate Hogan, who also served as co-chairs on last year's PFAS investigatory task force. And it's being heavily pushed by environmental and public health action organizations right now. There are already over 70 co-sponsors, and this number is ticking up. There's a lot of push behind it. It's very popular. It's kind of, like I said, it's a hot button issue. So this bill is titled "An Act to Protect Massachusetts Public Health from PFAS." And it will probably be known as the PFAS bill for the current session because it incorporates the findings and recommendations of the task force. And it lumps in a few other bills into the language, including toxic-free kids. So it has a lot of provisions, but most germane to our conversation, it establishes a PFAS remediation trust fund to help communities address contamination in soil, groundwater, drinking water. It phases out PFAS in all products by 2030. It sets an earlier deadline for the elimination of PFAS in food packaging, as well as in children's products, fabric treatments, a lot of other consumer products. And it directs the DEP to restrict industrial releases of PFAS, and it also limits certain uses of PFAS in firefighting equipment. So I'm going to break this down a little bit, starting with the PFAS Remediation Trust Fund. At face value, it might seem inconsequential to businesses, but the language actually provides that applicants to the fund, who are municipalities, they must first make reasonable efforts to obtain and use funds from liable or potentially liable third parties. So this means that municipalities will be coming after private entities who are found to have contributed to PFAS contamination. It will likely mean that this will become a breeding ground for lawsuits between these private entities and municipalities and the Commonwealth. And the state will have the right to recover payment from parties that are found to be liable for this contamination. The omnibus also includes the food packaging ban that we saw Rhode Island pass. It establishes that no manufacturer, retailer can sell food packaging to which PFAS has been intentionally added. And this would go into effect in January of 2026. It also prohibits the sale of the usual suspect products to which PFAS has been intentionally added. So child passenger restraints, cookware, personal care products, etc. This would go into effect in January of 2026 as well. It also would prohibit the sale of any product to which PFAS has been intentionally added, and that would go into effect in 2030. And there are some exemptions for this. They might determine that the use is unavoidable, and in that case, an exemption can be granted, but only for 3 years. So it's a really strong push to just fully phase out PFAS altogether. And also the omnibus would set really strict reporting requirements for manufacturers. This is going to change the way that businesses do business at pretty much the ground level up. And so by June 2026, this bill would require manufacturers of PFAS or PFAS containing products to register that product on a state constructed reporting platform. And on this platform, they have to list the name and type of the product, the universal product code, and how the PFAS is used by consumers, or how the product is used by consumers, specific names of every PFAS compound, and the CIS registry number, the amount of products sold in the state. It's pretty onerous. There's a lot of reporting requirements here. And on top of that, manufacturers of these products must send an electronic notification to distributors and wholesalers of the product that it contains PFAS. So we're starting to create a notification, line all the way from the manufacturer to the consumer, because those distributors that receive the notification from the manufacturer must then relay it to the consumer, either by way of labeling. It has to be visible, including for product listing for online sales. And all of this reporting and labeling requirements that would go into effect in January of 2026. And finally, on top of that, there are a lot of provisions in this bill, but we're just focusing on the ones that are most relevant to this conversation. But the last one I'll touch on is that manufacturers must test for the presence of unintentionally added PFAS using approved methods. And these are for products like personal care products, children's products, cookware. This would also go into effect in 2030. So you're talking about a really onerous implication on businesses. Even if a business is not intentionally adding PFAS, they will have to make sure that it's not getting in there at all. And so this will have a lot of implications. And I'm sure John can speak more to it, but this is that kind of rounds out the Massachusetts omnibus that we're going to be following really closely this session. And I'll hand it back to John.
Sure. Yeah. And thanks, Daria. And before we move on, I guess I just wanted to mention one thing. And Daria mentioned this when she was presenting. Massachusetts tends to, in some ways, even though it's very progressive, wait and see kind of what other states do or are doing. And so, clearly they're kind of following, to some degree, Rhode Island here. And I want to point out that they are both Rhode Island and Massachusetts are really following Maine, who has been really at the forefront of a lot of PFAS regulations and legislation and initiatives, which many may not realize. But most specifically, on January 1st of this year, after many years of debate, a regulation was finally passed and went into effect on January 1st of this year. Whereby Maine now has the same sort of testing and reporting to the state requirements that Daria just walked through that Rhode Island and Massachusetts are considering. And I think it's important to remember, no matter what state we're talking about, these states are contemplating not just making companies within their own states have these reporting requirements, but if you're selling to one of these states, no matter where you are, you will have to comply with these reporting requirements that the states are setting up. So Maine already has in place some form of infrastructure. Admittedly, it was the first state to start a program like this, and so I think there were a couple of hiccups. They had promised an online portal, for example, by January 1st, whereby all of this information could be entered to the state by the companies. That was not fulfilled, and now they're having people just send in forms. And there's actually still some debate and negotiation going on with respect to some of the language in the regulation. There are some exemptions that are still being carved out, even though the regulation is already in effect. So I think that Massachusetts and Rhode Island and other states who are contemplating the exact same thing are learning from what Maine has gone through. And it's only going to get more efficient for the states that enact these types of regulations. And I want to mention, you might be thinking, gosh, from a corporate perspective, this adds a lot of paperwork, this adds a lot of burden on us. It should, places costs on us to now test products. That's all true. Absolutely. But I want to also raise the fact and the concern that a lot of our clients have raised and that we've talked to them about and talked them through. And that is, once this reporting, this data goes into these reporting databases through these states, that's publicly available information. Some of the states are contemplating having it available on a website, easily searchable. Others maybe not, but through simple requests, you can obtain that data if you really wanted to. So what's the impact there? Well, I look forward to the litigation, which I believe is coming, the personal injury, sort of bodily injury litigation from a lot of the use of these consumers of these consumer products. That's all going to be data that's already there. You're reporting it as a company to the states. It can be obtained by plaintiff's counsel, and it can be used in future lawsuits to show the amount of PFAS that are in your products, the quantities, and when, if at all, the PFAS were phased out. So that's just one consideration. I think there's also another consideration and concern by companies that they may have difficulties understanding and figuring out whether or not there is in fact PFAS in their products. And that's something that we'll get to in just a second. But I just wanted to point that out with respect to Maine, who already has this type of system in place and is aggressively looking, as Daria mentioned, similar to what Massachusetts and Rhode Island want to do. They have already said, these types of products, these industries, these products are going to be banned by this date, but they're using this data that they're collecting to enact other bans much more quickly than just, for example, in Massachusetts, Daria said they're looking to 2030 to ban all intentionally added PFAS uses. Well, states like Maine or Rhode Island are saying, well, we might add others to the list sooner than that, depending on the data that we get from these types of companies. So they're using it to do their own sort of internal risk evaluation as well. So this all sounds, overwhelming to some degree. It can sound like a lot of doom and gloom, but we're here to help. And so, to conclude today's webinar, I thought maybe we would just look at some action steps that we can consider from here. First of all, this is certainly Daria's realm, and our in-house government team would do kind of the first two, but every single day, every single week, we are tracking legislation with respect to PFAS. And that may not sound overly burdensome, but as you saw from Daria's initial slide, just how many bills have been introduced and to some degree passed at the federal and in the state levels. That was just, the bar graphs are just showing the federal level and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. In many, many states across this country, we're seeing similar trends. So if you're selling to any other state in this country, you may be impacted by some of the laws or regulations that are being introduced there as well. So we track this information, and we also help companies and clients understand how it's actually going to impact them. One thing that I picked up on in the language that Daria was talking about, and that is, in a lot of these bills, is this use of the word intentionally added PFAS. Okay, so what does that mean? Each state is actually defining that slightly differently. It may sound very simple. It may sound like sort of a knowing standard. Do I know that I'm putting PFAS in my product? That may be what it means in one state, but that may not be what it means in another state. For example, there are states that define knowing or intentional addition of PFAS as if you have information or you can obtain information from your supply chain that they are sending you products or components that have PFAS in them, and you then use them in your products, that is an intentional use of PFAS under some state regulations that are being introduced. It may sound counterintuitive, it may not sound fair, but that's how they're defining it. So, in addition to just simply telling our clients and telling you what legislation is being filed, we're helping you understand how it actually can impact you and will impact you. Similar to that, Daria is a certified lobbyist. We also have two others in the firm who are certified lobbyists in both, in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and actually Michigan. And so, one of the things that we help clients with is actually lobby for change if necessary in some of the language, because it may seem quite onerous. It may seem overly burdensome. It may seem unfair. And I know that there are a lot of downstream companies that are significantly impacted by all of these regulations that are being discussed. So we help navigate any sort of lobbying process that our clients may wish in this PFAS area. The other thing that we can help with, and that absolutely any company right now attending this webinar or who gets it later on through a recording should do, is understand your supply chain. You have to do this. This is the number one thing that if you don't already have a grasp on, you have to try and do so now. And we fully realize the difficulties in doing this. Not all countries across the globe have the same reporting standards as the US. You may ask for the information, you may never get a response. You may get a response that says something vague, like there's no toxic substances in this product, don't worry about it. But that's not enough. You have to do whatever you can to understand exactly what your supply chain is sending you, what is going into your products, what's going into your manufacturing processes. Because again, if you don't take this initial and cost-effective step, you are going to be saddled with burdens of testing the products yourselves, sending that information to the state. The state could follow up and request more information, and then you could be subject to outright bans. So you need to understand from that perspective what your supply chain is sending you, but you also need to understand what your supply chain is sending you so you can understand whether or not these bans are going to impact you, and if so, when, so you can adjust your business practices. In addition, I mentioned that there's potential legal liability that can come from use of PFAS, whether that's through personal injury lawsuits that may come in the future, and I believe will come in the future, or if it's through some of the environmental pollution litigation that we are seeing and involved in for clients because of the federal and state standards with respect to drinking water and Superfund issues. You have to understand what PFAS risks you have and what that looks like and how that might play out for your company in terms of litigation risk. We can help you do that. We represent companies across numerous different industries, from electronics to recycling, all the way down to tire recycling facilities. So it doesn't matter where you are in the industrial chain, which industrial vertical you're a part of, we can help you navigate litigation risk assessment. And then, sort of finally, from our perspective, and we already alluded to this, you have to understand, and we can help you navigate what your actual obligations are to the state for reporting. Some states have very simple reporting requirements. They're not overly burdensome. But again, others have more complex systems that they are contemplating or, considering putting into place. We can help you with that as well. And then finally, we are not financial advisors, of course, but whoever you may employ to help you understand financial risks from all of these things that we've talked about. Part of what we do is work with in-house financial teams to understand, what's the probability of some of these things actually happening and impacting your type of company, given your very specific type of situation and facts. So these are just some of the many ways that we help and can help. And so I think to reiterate not just who we are, since you've heard us talk for almost an hour now, but just how to reach us. We'd be more than happy to talk to you about any of the topics that myself or Daria talked about today, and we'd be more than happy to help you navigate any of the issues that we raised and any of the ways that we can help companies navigate all of these issues. So I think with that, I just want to thank everyone very much. Please do reach out with any questions that you may have. And thank you very much for attending today. And thank you, Daria, for all your great insights on all this all this legislation that's being introduced and that's been passed.
Of course. Thank you, John. This is great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.